This is New York Harbor on the morning of January 1st, 1892. The air smells of salt water and coal smoke, of fish and tar, and the particular cold of a winter Atlantic. Somewhere in that harbor, a steamship called the Nevada is making its final approach. On its deck, crowded with passengers who have not slept properly in 12 days, a 17-year-old girl from County Cork, Ireland, is gripping the railing and watching a copper statue rise from the fog. She does not yet know that her name will be recorded in history. She does not yet know that within minutes of stepping ashore, a stranger will decide whether she stays or is sent back across the ocean. She only knows that she has arrived. What you are about to see was reconstructed from 19th century photographs, lithographs, and newspaper engravings, brought back to life using AI to put you inside a world that has never been fully shown. And you will discover that the door was not what it seemed. Her name was Annie Moore. And what happened to her on this single morning, and what waited for millions who followed, is a story that has never fully been told. To understand what Annie Moore felt as the Nevada entered New York Harbor, you must first understand the scale of what she was sailing toward. By 1892, New York was no longer merely America's largest city. It was one of the great metropolises of the world. In just 2 decades, its population had grown from roughly 1 million to over 2 million people, and was still climbing. More ships docked here than in any other port in the Western Hemisphere. More immigrants poured through its harbor than through any other gateway on Earth. And the girl gripping the railing on the Nevada's deck was about to become the first official immigrant it ever processed. She was 17 years old, from County Cork, Ireland. Her parents had crossed years earlier. Now it was her turn, responsible for her 2 younger brothers, Anthony and Philip, crossing the Atlantic alone. The ship had departed Queenstown on December 20th, 1891. 12 days in steerage, cramped, unsanitary, hundreds of people sharing a space built for cargo, little light, little ventilation, and in rough Atlantic weather, constant seasickness, tuberculosis, dysentery, measles, the invisible passengers traveling alongside the human ones. One day of ocean, then another, then another. 12 days, 12 nights, and then finally a stillness in the water that meant land was close. And then, on the morning of January 1st, 1892, as the Nevada entered New York Harbor, none of that mattered. Because there, rising from the water, was the Statue of Liberty, unveiled just 6 years earlier, still new, still startling, still capable of producing a silence on crowded decks. Annie Moore would have understood, in the way only someone who has survived 11 days in steerage can understand, what that copper figure meant. Not safety, not arrival, something harder to name. The intoxicating possibility of becoming someone the old country never allowed you to be. The harbor itself was a spectacle. More than 70% of all immigrants entering the United States came through this water. Steam ferries crisscrossing between Manhattan and Brooklyn. Ocean liners from Liverpool, Hamburg, Naples, Queenstown. The waterfront a forest of masts and smokestacks, the air a mixture of coal smoke and fish and tar, the smell of the new world announcing itself. But here is the thing no one told Annie Moore as she stood at that railing, watching the harbor come into focus. The door she was about to walk through had 2 sides. One side was the golden door of the poem, the one Emma Lazarus had written 6 years earlier, the one that said, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. The other side was something else entirely, and she was about to find out which side she was on. But first, you need to understand why 12 million people were willing to risk everything to reach this single point on the map. Every ship in that harbor carries a story. Every person on every deck has a reason. To understand why New York in 1892 was the destination of millions, you must understand the 5 great forces pulling the world toward this single point on the map. The first pillar was freedom from persecution. Picture a Jewish family in Odessa in 1891. A father, a mother, 3 daughters. One night, the sound of breaking glass. The pogroms had arrived. Government-sanctioned attacks burning homes, destroying businesses, murdering thousands. The May laws had already restricted where they could live, what work they could do. America was not merely a destination. For families like this one, it was the only alternative to annihilation. Close behind was the second pillar, escape from poverty. In Sicily, in Calabria, a contadino, a peasant farmer, kneels in a field his family has worked for 4 generations. The soil is exhausted, the rent is due, his children are hungry. The promise of factory wages in New York was not just attractive. It was the difference between a future and no future at all. Then came the third pillar, the industrial engine. America was building itself at a speed the world had never seen. Railroads across a continent, steel mills running day and night, textile factories hungry for hundreds of thousands of hands. The fourth pillar was family. Picture a letter written in a cramped hand on thin paper, traveling by ship from a tenement room on Mulberry Street back to a village in Calabria. Not describing wealth, describing survival. I am here. I found work. Come. A husband goes first, sends that letter home. Then his brother comes. Then his wife. Then his cousin. By 1892, every arriving ship carried passengers who already had a name and an address waiting for them. And somewhere on that ship, somewhere in steerage, Annie Moore was thinking of her parents, already waiting on the dock. The fifth pillar, the most powerful and the most elusive, was the idea of America itself. Not the America that existed, crowded and unequal and often brutal, but the America that was promised, of the Declaration of Independence, of the self-made man, of the frontier that never closed. It was, in the words of one historian, a rumor of hope that proved impossible to silence. 5 pillars. 5 reasons why 12 million people would risk everything to reach this harbor. But here is what none of them knew, what no one told them in the villages of Sicily, or the shtetls of Ukraine, or the towns of County Cork. The door was not open to everyone. There were conditions. There were doctors with button hooks and clerks with 29 questions. And for some, America would end before it ever began. Annie Moore was about to find out what kind of door it really was. On January 1st, 1892, the new federal immigration station on Ellis Island opened its doors for the very first time. Before this date, immigrants had been processed at Castle Garden, a facility overwhelmed, chaotic, and riddled with corruption. Ellis Island was the federal government's answer, systematic, controlled, official. But it was built on a precise logic. First-class passengers were processed aboard ship and walked directly into Manhattan. Only the steerage passengers, the poorest, the most vulnerable, the most numerous, were ferried to the island for inspection. Those who could afford a cabin were assumed self-sufficient. Those who could not were assumed a risk. Annie Moore and her brothers were among the first to disembark. The staff was new. The procedures were untested. And Annie, 17 years old, red-haired, clutching her brother's hands, walked to the front of the line. Charles Hendley, a clerk from the Secretary of the Treasury's office, inked her name and those of her brothers, Anthony and Philip, into the first page of the first registry book. Then, John B. Weber, the Federal Superintendent of Immigration, called her forward and placed a $10 gold coin in her palm, a gift for being the very first. A Catholic chaplain blessed her and gave her a silver coin. A stranger in the crowd pressed a $5 gold piece into her hand. For a girl who had crossed an ocean in steerage, that coin represented something almost incomprehensible, more than 2 weeks of factory wages. The reporters present described her expression as pure, overwhelmed astonishment. Stand in that line for a moment. To your left, a young Italian man holds a folded letter. An address in Brooklyn, the only thing in his pocket he cannot afford to lose. Behind you, a Jewish family from Odessa, the mother adjusting her daughter's coat collar, smoothing it flat again and again. Beside them, a Polish laborer, enormous calloused hands, staring straight ahead at nothing. No one is talking loudly. The hall is full of thousands of people, and it sounds, strangely, almost like silence. This is the last moment before everything is decided. Everyone here has already survived the hardest part, and everyone here is about to find out if it was enough. This wasn't just a waiting room. It was a courtroom without a judge. The physicians, U.S. Public Health Service officers, positioned themselves along the line and conducted the 6-second physical, a rapid scan for disease or disability. Trachoma, grounds for immediate deportation, showed in seconds with a button hook to the inner eyelid. A person's gait revealed neurological conditions or malnutrition. Those who passed moved to registry desks. 29 questions: name, age, occupation, destination. Do you have money? Do you have someone waiting for you? Most were through and on the ferry within 3 to 5 hours. But the system was imperfect. The same condition might pass one day and fail another. And there were categories of exclusion so vague they could apply to almost anyone. What happened next was not a formality. It was a verdict. Imagine you are standing in that line. You have sold everything to pay for the crossing. You have survived 11 days in steerage. You have watched the Statue of Liberty rise from the fog and felt, for the first time in years, something that felt like hope. And then a doctor looks at your eyes for 6 seconds and pulls you out of the line. Everything stops. The noise of the hall, the shuffling of feet, the murmur of languages, all of it falls away. There is only the doctor's hand on your arm and the door that is closing before you ever walked through it. Approximately 2% of all immigrants who arrived at Ellis Island were denied entry and sent back. In the peak years, tens of thousands per year. Not criminals, not dangerous. Mostly the sick, the weak, the unlucky. People who had spent everything they had to make the crossing and who were told in a language they may not have understood that America did not want them. Families were separated without warning. A mother passed, a child did not. A husband admitted, a wife detained. Some were held for months. Some were put back on ships to countries where persecution or poverty awaited them. For these people, America ended on a small island in the harbor before they ever touched the mainland. Annie Moore passed. Her brothers passed. But in the minutes before her name was called, she would not have known she was going to pass. She was thin, retired, responsible for 2 children. She faced the same doctor with the same button hook as everyone else. She was no more certain of the outcome than the Italian man to her left or the family from Odessa behind her. The $10 coin came after. The fear came first. And here is the question that no button hook and no registry clerk could ever answer. The question beneath every examination in that hall. What is a nation and who does it belong to? What waited on the other side of that ferry was a city that had never stopped arguing about the answer. Annie Moore stepped off the Ellis Island ferry and into Lower Manhattan. This is what she walked into. This is Hester Street in 1892, a world simultaneously overwhelming and, strangely, familiar, full of people who arrived 6 months ago or 6 years ago, who speak your language and know the same songs. By the 1890s, the Lower East Side had become the most densely populated place on Earth. In some blocks, more than 1,000 people per acre. Tenement buildings packed so tightly that sunlight rarely reached the streets below. Families of 6, 7, 8 people in 2 or 3 rooms. No running water, no toilets, no ventilation. Jacob Riis had been documenting these conditions since the 1880s. His book, How the Other Half Lives, published just 2 years before Annie arrived, had shocked middle-class readers who had never seen inside a tenement. And yet, Hester Street was also, improbably, magnificently alive. A street market 6 days a week, pushcart vendors shouting prices in Yiddish, women haggling over a chicken, children darting between carts, the endless overlapping music of a dozen languages coexisting on a single block. Step inside one of these tenement rooms and hold still. Light filters through a single grimy window, not enough to read by. The air is thick with boiling cabbage and damp wool. A family of 7 sleeps here. Children on the floor, on coats, on rags. On the table, a heel of bread, a candle burned almost to nothing. On the wall, nailed crookedly, a small religious image, the one object that survived the crossing. In the corner, a woman bends over unfinished garments, doing piecework by failing light, sewing shirtwaists at 2 cents apiece, calculating how many she needs to finish before morning to make the rent. A child coughs in the dark. She does not look up. She cannot afford to stop. Tuberculosis, the White Plague, killed more New Yorkers than any other disease. It thrived in exactly this kind of room. Many who had been waved through the Great Hall were already carrying it in their lungs. But 20 blocks to the north, in a city that might as well have been another country, no one was worrying about tuberculosis. Annie Moore would never set foot on 5th Avenue. Walk 20 minutes north from Hester Street and you enter a different civilization, one that had no awareness of her existence and no interest in acquiring one. The Vanderbilt family had built multiple mansions along this stretch, marble facades, grand ballrooms, art collections assembled from the galleries of Europe. William Vanderbilt's mansion cost $3 million. In a year when the average factory worker earned less than $500, that number was not merely large, it was a declaration. New York in 1892 carried 2 realities at once: glamour and grit, marble and mud, the smell of perfume on 5th Avenue and the smell of boiling cabbage on Hester Street. 20 minutes apart, a century away from each other. By 1890, the richest 1% owned more wealth than the bottom 50% combined. Mark Twain called it the Gilded Age, glittering on the surface, concealing something much darker beneath. The connection between these 2 New Yorks was not incidental. it was structural. The garment factories of the Lower East Side produced the fashionable clothing that Fifth Avenue displayed. The construction workers building the elevated railways and the new skyscrapers were largely immigrant men from Italy, Ireland, and Eastern Europe. The cooks and maids and laundresses who maintained the great households were women who had stood in the Great Hall and answered 29 questions and been waved through. The two New Yorks needed each other. They simply did not see each other. Annie Moore spent the rest of her life on the Lower East Side and later the Bronx. She never became famous. She never became wealthy. But she became something that had not existed before her, an Irish American carrying both worlds at once. And in that, she was 12 million people. The question Ellis Island raised in 1892 had no clean answer then, and it has no clean answer now. But in the streets of the Lower East Side, in the tenement rooms and the pushcart markets and the crowded synagogues and the Catholic churches, the people who had passed through that great hall were giving their own answer, one life at a time. The America of 1892 was dedicated in its founding documents to the proposition that all men are created equal. And yet, the Immigration Act of 1891 had established the first systematic machinery for deciding who was worthy of those rights and who was not. The Golden Door had a lock. W.E.B. Du Bois would later write about the double consciousness of those at the margins of American society, seeing oneself through the eyes of a world simultaneously welcoming and suspicious. Annie Moore and the millions who followed her would have recognized it immediately, arriving in a place that called itself the land of freedom, and discovering that freedom, like everything else in America, had conditions. The philosophers of Europe spent centuries arguing about what makes a nation: blood, language, soil, religion. America's answer was simpler and more radical: an idea. Any person from any country speaking any language could become American, not by birth, but by arriving and choosing to stay. That idea was being tested in real time in that great hall, with every person who stepped forward and answered 29 questions. And yet they stayed. They built. They created neighborhoods and schools and labor unions. They learned English, or they didn't, and their children did. They became Irish American and Italian American and Jewish American. That hyphen that was not a division, but a bridge, a way of holding two worlds at once. They did not become less Irish or less Italian or less Jewish. They became something new, something that had not existed before, something that could only have been made here, in this city, in this moment, by people willing to cross an ocean on the strength of a rumor that hope was possible. Annie Moore lived the rest of her life on the Lower East Side. She died in 1924, the same year the Immigration Act closed the Golden Door. 12 million people had passed through it. The country on the other side would never be the same. Today, Ellis Island is a museum, but close to 40% of all Americans can trace at least one ancestor to that hall. Annie Moore's gold coin has multiplied beyond counting. Belonging is not given. It is built, slowly, one generation at a time. Somewhere in all of this, a 17-year-old girl from County Cork is stepping forward. The coin is placed in her palm. The new century is coming through that door. If this journey moved you, subscribe so you don't miss the next era we bring back to life. Together, we keep history reborn. See you in the next era.